Cohen.
Hey, Boots, how are you?
I'm doing okay. I'm doing good.
Yeah.
But for everyone joining, we are really thrilled, excited to have Boots Riley here, a legend, a filmmaker, an activist, a composer, a rapper, an intellectual, and just a great human. It's for the little bit.
Yeah.
So welcome.
Thank you very much.
All right, Jesse, take it away.
So Boots, where did this idea for 13-foot African-American living in Oakland come from?
I don't know. I do not remember.
Does he live in your neighborhood?
No, not in my neighborhood. There are real neighborhoods in Oakland involved, but not one that I'm actually. Yeah, I live in Fruitvale, so that's part of the show. But yeah, no, he doesn't live in Fruitvale.
So obviously it's a very active time going on right now. How is this time different than say the 20s in terms of being an activist? It's like it.
Well, let's say it's different in a lot of ways, but one thing I want to talk about first is the similarities that aren't being talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So in the month of April this year, we had 300 strikes across the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't really get reported on much at all. Since then, I think March 16th, there's been 900 strikes across the United States. We haven't had a strike wave that big since the 40s, and maybe this is bigger than something at the end of the 40s, as far as that's concerned. We don't feel that right now because that's a particular thing that folks don't want, that they don't want talked about. They don't want that infused into the narrative. So some of these things, a lot of these strikes were, as you know, around COVID and, what the employer would allow and would do to protect the workers. And some of them, though, were around Black Lives Matter. And some of them were radical in nature. They weren't just, they already were starting off at a certain point where they weren't just striking for more wages. They were striking for other ideas. GE workers went on strike and said, we don't want to make jet engines anymore. We want to make ventilators. Now that's a solidarity happening there that isn't happening, that we don't hear about. In the Midwest, there were whole restaurants that walked out just with the demand that they stop giving the 25% discount to cops, right? And I'm talking about the workers at those restaurants doing that. But the idea, so there's a similarity in the sense that in the 20s and 30s, there were there were strikes happening all over the place, and many of them led by folks with an outwardly radical, openly radical vision behind them. It wasn't just like we're striking for this and for that, for these particular things. It was saying we're striking and this is part of a larger campaign, a larger movement to actually change the whole system. And this was happening this was happening in the places that we consider red states. It was happening there as well, right? Places, so in the red states now, their great grandparents and grandparents were actually made the states actually red. Those were communist places that were thought of as hotbeds of communist activity. And the left abandoned those areas and started focusing on universities and cities. And
why do you think that, socialism has such a bad name now?
What are you talking about? It doesn't.
Yeah?
Yeah, hell no. I mean, think about this. For The last 8 years, they've been publishing these surveys, and many of them, and not only by folks that you might consider more objective pollsters, but like even right-wing folks, and they all agree on this. 51% of millennials say they want a socialist society. That number is way higher than that if you talk about the generation younger than them, right? Of all the ages put together, 43% of the United States says they want a socialist society. Now, then you got to add in the folks that actually agree with the ideas of socialism, but would never say that to a pollster, right?
You know, do you think it's, you know, when you talk about the 20s, you know, a lot of take the longshoremen, you know, they never thought they could be organized, but they did get organized,
exactly.
Right? So do you think now our interests are held apart in a different way when we have the rise of these giant corporations? Is it harder to fight a company like Amazon than it was to, you know, sort of get organized before?
Well, obviously, every situation has its own objective differences, so there's no way to say they're exactly the same. But as you rightly brought up, everybody was naysaying the idea of organizing longshoremen, right? They were considered to be the least skilled of workers, like they were thought of like as, you know, less skilled than a janitor or something like that, because they're just lifting stuff. And, you know, that was what was put out there. There was no one site to work at, because the docks can be all over the place, and then they could ship over here instead of right there. So it was thought of as not site specific. So how are you going to organize that? High turnover. People would get fired after one day often, and they'd have them replaced, right? So it was thought as almost impossible, even during the time while everybody was getting organized, right? So that's a good example of similar thing happening at Amazon. But right now, Amazon, they just a couple weeks ago, right over here at the San Leandro hub, workers led a car caravan, and shut down a hub for a couple hours, just with the idea that they should shut down the shops and clean them for a couple hours, shut down the distribution center and clean them. Things are getting organized, and you're seeing that happen. But is it going to be hard? Yeah. And part of it is just that point where people are involved, people want something to happen, but they're afraid it won't win. Yeah. Right? So they're weighing out the differences, you know, between what they think they should do and what that risk is.
You know, what's the difference between like the way that FDR ultimately had the New Deal? You know, did he just give that to us, or
thanks for the softballs. I will definitely take that. It is, you know, a lot of people point to, a lot of people talk about, when they talk about incrementalism, for instance, when they point to certain legislation that has made life better for folks, and I would say the two pillars of that in liberal discussion are the civil rights movement and the New Deal. And what happened with what was happening at the time of the New Deal is, as we were saying, you had strike waves going on all over the United States. You had the Communist Party USA during the 20s and 30s, according to Seeing Red, the documentary that came out in the 80s by the same person that did, I forget, she just did, Julia Reichardt. that in the 20s and 30s, the Communist Party had 1 million card-carrying communists. And that was at a time when the United States only had a population of 130 million people, right? So the influence was big. We had folks occupying factories, taking it over, saying, you're not gonna have this back. We had in places like Alabama, miners going on strikes, shooting it out with hired thugs by the corporations, right? There's a movie called Matewan that talks about one such thing. You have places in Colorado where Rockefeller came in and just mowed people down, right? This battle was intense. This was a level of struggle that that made the ruling class shake in their boots. And you had places like Montana, Utah, Oklahoma, Montana, and Alabama, like I said, being called hotbeds of communist activity. And this was also that radicalism, even when it didn't show up as multiracial on the surface, and it did show up in that way in certain cases, but it was, if you read like Hosea Hudson, Life of a Negro Communist in the South, he talks about Alabama in the 1920s and 30s and how he was working at a factory. He's a black man, and he was working in Alabama in a factory, and he joined the Communist Party. And it took him 3 years before he realized there were white communists as well, because there were that many black communists in there. And some of the history we get told about other movements that were happening at that time, like Marcus Garvey, they leave out the fact that his cadre of folks leading his movement were the Brotherhood, were the African Blood Brotherhood, and they were a Communist Party organization, right? So at the same time, there have recently been revolutions happening all over the world. You had strikes happening all over the place, and it was in that milieu that the New Deal came to be. And it was to stem the tide of this movement that was happening. And I'm not saying that in a bad way, but I'm saying that's how it was won, right? Mm-hmm. It was won because you had this movement able to shut down production, and they knew that it would only get worse for them if they didn't do that. So it wouldn't have been able to happen otherwise,
But I'm going to jump in. I have a question, because you say you have this percentage of millennials, they're engaged in socialism. I read something in the middle of the night. I shouldn't have gotten up and done that. That there's also this, maybe it was in that same context, a lot of young people do not believe in democracy anymore. They don't even understand what it is. So where's all of it coming from? What is where, and then where?
Well, so here's the thing, is I think part of this, I don't have an answer to that, but I think part of the equation is that we've been being lied to about just how radical the population of the US actually is, right? Because a lot of what media is—
like lied to, like we haven't been told there's more than we think, or less?
Yeah, we've been told that folks are more right-wing than we think. My band had this album cover that actually came out before 9/11, and it had the Twin Towers exploding.
Yeah.
And so we there was all this stuff all over the news, connecting it and all that kind of stuff. And I went, because of that, I used that platform to go on the news and say there should be no war for oil, and that we shouldn't even bomb Afghanistan, right? And so there was a lot of controversy about my group, The Coup, and the album. In the midst of that, we had a booking that was already in place where we were opening up for this MTV connected band, the group called the Executioners, who had a song with Linkin Park. And so it was an MTV tour, MTV sponsored tour, going all over the place. And so it wasn't going to be our fans, it was going to be MTV fans. And a couple of my band members were like, I'm not going because people are already making death threats and you're out here speaking against the war. And as we see on the news, everybody's waving flags and stuff like that. So and they knew I was going to say something against the war at all these places, and they didn't want to be part of it. So we had to get substitutes, and we went out there.
So what did that feel like that night when they dropped out? I mean, because this is at the beginning of your thing. Were you fearful? Were you?
No,
Did you know you had to take a stand? You know, what did it?
I mean, my only reason I got into doing music or art in any form was because of these things that I believed. I started out as an organizer. So I was made for those kind of moments, right? And it was not like, you know, like I would have missed my whole reason. You know, like if I miss those moments, I'm missing my whole reason that I'm doing what I'm doing, is to express what I believe, you know, about the world. So, you know, no, I wasn't actually scared about it. I mean, I did, you know, been in fights before, and I know that something like that could happen. But, you know, I don't know. I didn't think that there would be any assassins. I didn't think anybody thought I was important enough for that. Right. And, but we went, and we were going, part of the reason they dropped out is we were going to these places: Montana, Utah, Texas, Louisiana, Florida, Ohio, things like that. And every time we would play, again, this is not a coup crowd, so they're not already on board before we get there. We're having to win them over musically. And then just when we win them over musically, I stopped the music and I would say this speech that had something to do with, I have a friend named Jeremy Glick, whose father had died in 9/11, and he had sent me an email saying, let everybody know there should be no war for oil in my father's name, right? And so I would say this, and at all these places, there would be a rousing ovation, cheers, because they hadn't heard, in many cases, anyone saying that we shouldn't be bombing Afghanistan, and anyone laying it out in that way. And I was surprised. I thought there would be, you know, debate and argument and stuff like that. But what and there were a couple. One was a Navy SEAL in Florida that was the security guard, and all the other security guards had to hold him back and all that kind of stuff, right? And then, he was a security guard at the club. And the other was in Cleveland, like this dude that kind of looked like a biker or whatever. As I'm speaking, he's like, fuck you, right? And then, and at the end of every show, I'm going out in the crowd and I'm talking to people. I always just go directly off the stage into the crowd. And so I'm thinking I'm gonna have to get in a fight with this dude. Not that I'm thinking I'm tough or anything, just thinking, you know, I'll something's gonna happen, right? And sure enough, I get a tap on my shoulder. And he's like, I just want to apologize. You know, I was thinking one thing when you were talking, and then everybody talked to me and told me what you were really saying, that I couldn't really hear it. And everybody told me what you were really talking about. You're talking about how they're using us and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, that was the closest that we got. But what I realized is that all of these people thought everybody else in the room was for the war. Right?
Right.
Yeah.
Because that's what they told us, you know? And I had, at the time, I was trying to help Refuse and Resist get people to sign this thing against the war. And I talked to a lot of people that were known recording artists at the time who you feel like are kind of, I don't know, not that you think they're left, but progressive in some way. And usually it was just like, look, the record label is saying that if I say something against the war, people are going to boycott my album. Mm-hmm. And so therefore I can't do it. So a lot of this stuff is controlled. And I'm just using that as an example that even in that time when it seems like the country is lockstep in a certain way, it could be very, very different, right? And so and which is why we got surprised when Occupy happened. And there was an Occupy encampment in every single town across the United States, little towns, big towns, all over the place. And people were like, where did this come from? It was always there. Like people have, like there are things that, you know, I didn't know until I read well after high school in Howard Zinn that St. Louis basically had a socialist revolution in the 1880s, right? Mm-hmm. Where they took over the town. Like, so, you know, contradictions of racism and all of that, that all exists. But we get taught this history that wipes out the radicalism in it, where, mm-hmm. and we don't, and so we have a view of who everybody else's ancestors are, where they were, who was against who, all of these things happening. And we have a different idea of what else is around us. And it's just now coming to the point where people are willing to openly talk about it. And I think one of my contentions is that one of the reasons that people are willing to put the word socialism on it. Meanwhile, like, you know, you had certain organizations that used to be radical that wouldn't even use the word socialism, you know, in their thing. But when the Republicans decided to call Obama a socialist, that was it for the word. Okay, the word is going to be, you know, people were like, oh, okay, he's a socialist. Maybe he's really, you know, maybe he's real. Maybe he's on the, you know, maybe he is on the left. And people voted. Some people voted for him because they thought if he was, you know, progressive enough to be even lied about being a socialist, that maybe he was for the people, which he wasn't. But whatever, that's a whole nother story.
Question on the left. I mean, if we have not told the story of the radical left, or however you want to call it, the extreme radical, have we told the story of the right, the really extreme, the Proud Boys, the white supremacists? Like, do we have that story as well?
That's called every cop show you've ever seen. They just use nice actors and very empathetic people to play them.
But I mean, do you think that like, how do we, you're right, that is what's in the system, and we grow up with that. So how do we combat that? How do you think about taking that on, right, as a concept?
Maybe I'm misunderstanding.
Well, no, it's just that I think what's important, I mean, I guess that's your point of view, and I understand it when you just said it that way. It's like, or maybe they get too much time. Maybe they get too much time. And you're saying if it's a cop story, or the guys get, you know, the kind of, I'm just trying to look at the other side of the equation with the radical left, and there's the radical right, which unfortunately to me is.
Well, we get taught those ideas, like the ideas that Proud Boys are talking about are not too far off from the ideas we learned in high school, right? This manifest destiny, and you know, the idea that this system is a merit-based system, right? We get taught that. It's part of, like, it's in the law. If it's in the law in California, I'm sure it's in the law almost every place else, which is that you can't paint socialism in a good light in public school, or else you could get fired. Now, I know there's some great teachers who break that law, but the point is that they have that hanging over you all the time. So, you know, but we get taught these ideals, and those ideals of the far right, of the Proud Boys, you know, you could trace every one of them to something we were taught in social studies class that supposedly was the way you're supposed to think.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's an important point. Really important.
You know, had you already been familiar with Rage Against the Machine when you went on the Tell Us the Truth tour? Or is that the first time you were really?
I had a friend of mine, we had an organization called the Young Comrades, and one of the dudes that was in the Young Comrades had been in LA, and I guess Zach had this warehouse there or something like that. I don't know too much about it, but he had a warehouse with community organizations. This person had been part of that. And so he brought me backstage to, my first time hearing Rage Against the Machine was when he brought me backstage at this South Shoreline Amphitheater. And I'm hearing the revolutionary lyrics, and I'm seeing the crowd just jump up and down and going crazy. And Zach comes off stage after their thing. We shake hands. I'm like, wow, this is amazing. He's like, yeah, I'm not really into this. I'm more of a hip hop dude. And I was like, well, you better get into this because we need them to, you know, make a movement. And, you know, like that was my first time. That was the first words out of his mouth, me. And so, yeah, I spent a lot of time trying to get, not a lot, but I've spent a good number of sessions trying to get Zach to get it back.
No, when you started playing with Tom Morello, is there something special about Tom? I mean, his guitar really, you know, it's like he plays it like it's a weapon. You know, is there something about your collaboration that?
I mean, you know, the way he looks at the guitar is like how I like looking at art, which is like, you know, there's no wrong way to do art. It's just that you figure out how to get to the thing you want. And he seems to look at that guitar and just do things with it that other people wouldn't do. And the point is the result, not whether it's the right way or the wrong way. It's what it's making you feel when you hear it. Yeah. And so, yeah, that definitely was good. But our first tour together, my first time meeting, because at that meeting with Zach, I didn't meet Tom. He kind of just walked right past. And my first time meeting Tom that I know of was, he just sent me an email out of the blue. It was like, hey, we're doing this acoustic tour. You want to come? And so, yeah, that was a tour with me, Tom, Billy Bragg, Steve Earle, Lester Chambers. So it was definitely a very different thing for me.
And what was that like backstage? Did you hang out with Billy Bragg?
Oh yeah. It you know, it was like a songwriting. It was like a songwriting lab, a traveling songwriting lab where we would talk about songs and lyrics and like because they have a different approach to them, and I was getting more into songwriting as opposed to I think the style that I was more associated with, which has I don't know. Well, I don't really want to get into all that, but the point is that yeah. So we were talking about songs and you know like turns of phrases and things like that, and that was really cool. I have a song called "Laugh, Love, Fuck," which is my version of a Billy Bragg song. I mean, there's not really a Billy Bragg song that's that, but it's like, what would Billy Bragg write? And that was
right. And then, or what were we gonna say, Priscilla?
What are the lyrics? The first.
Well, the chorus is, "I'm here to laugh, love, fuck, and drink liquor, and help the damn revolution come quicker."
Nice.
So.
Now, at which point did you start thinking, now I gotta take this and make it into movies? In your mind, are songs and movies the same thing, just different expressions of a different idea?
Well, I mean, everything from talking to painting to songwriting or any art is should be an expression of of what's inside you. I always tell people that you have to be passionate about something more than you're passionate about the actual art, right? Because you need something that's driving those decisions you're making, and you need a reason to be doing it. If you're in love with, if you're a songwriter that's just in love with making songs only, but not really with a passion, then that's like talking to someone who loves talking. And that could be very insanity creating, all right? Like they'll know all the cadences that they could use, have a firm grip on various vocabulary, and hours will pass and you'll be mad at yourself. So, but I started out actually, when I got radicalized and joined a radical party when I was 15. And 14, 15. And part of that process was I was being part of these summer projects in Delano and McFarland in the Central California Valley, where we were helping to organize an anti-racist farm workers union. And there, and I did that for a few summers in a row, but there was still the legend, which didn't exist anymore, but there was the legend of Teatro Campesino. And,
I know them, love them, love
okay.
them.
Boots, when you were when you went there, you had to leave your town and went to a more rural community. Was that totally different for you? The groups of people you met there were different than you had known?
I'm trying to think so I had already done a couple years in Stockton, which definitely is not as rural as those areas, and Durham, North Carolina, which is where my father's from. So I knew small town, but these were small towns. Like you could see McFarland, you can see from one end to the other, right? And and like population 2,000 or something like that. And so it was really boring, right? Like in that sense, like the whole thing was to walk across the bridge and get a icy from the AM PM, right? And that was where everybody was at, right? Those sorts of things. So, just life is, and that's what you're noticing when you're 14 and 15. But as far as the rural aspect of it, but the folks that were leading that union or organizing effort, it was called the Anti-Racist Farm Workers Union. And they were folks who had been students in the 60s in Mexico and had left because of the massacre in 68, which actually kind of gets told in the movie Roma. And they left because they were radicals and they wanted to they did want to come here to be safe, but they wanted to keep the revolution happening. And they had heard Cesar Chavez was the thing. They came there, and then they found out that he wasn't exactly a radical. And they were, the UFW at the time was, full of like trying to help deport undocumented workers and having, anyway, that's getting into the weeds on that. They broke off and did their own thing. And but so that education I got from them, from those folks, and mind you, this was like, I had taken a year of Spanish. So like some of the folks that were the leaders of this, were communicating in broken Spanish and, all of that kind of stuff. And some of them spoke very fluent English, so I could communicate with those folks. But the education I got from them was about like connecting these practical things. Like, we are trying to organize this field of workers right here, this particular one, to have this particular work stoppage happen, which can then spread to this part of this valley, because we know we have people working in this field and that field. And then from that valley, we can then get the truck drivers involved. Like, their plan had to do with here and now strikes, building up to a revolutionary movement.
Now, as you're learning that, Boots, is there a particular mentor, and what music and art and literature and movies are they pointing you at to what's influencing you in that time?
Yeah. So it was interesting. The organization that there was a radical, more traditional party that I joined called the Progressive Labor Party. And
you're 14, right?
Yeah. Well, by the time I actually joined, I was 15, but yeah. They had a mass organization, as they would call it, called the International Committee Against Racism. And then there was this group that was part of both of them, which was the Anti-Racist Farm Workers Union. So, but the Progressive Labor Party were very hardcore. Like they thought that, artists were wishy-washy and like, and technically you become a petty bourgeois, person, like, in technical economic terms, right? Like you're doing something, so, and there was this kind of battle going on in there between how to make like revolutionary art, and if you could exist as just an artist and all of that. So it was somewhat strange. So I didn't necessarily get pointed to a lot of stuff at that time, right? And so I got that outside of it. There were a few people that like, so one of the guys that was part of it was a guy that had gotten politicized during the miners' strikes in Britain and had come to the United States and was part of this organization. And so like from him, I learned about Lyndon Kwesi Johnson, right? And, but to me, like, you're looking for stuff that sounds like that sounds like now, like you're not, like when you're 15, like musically, you don't want the past. You want to feel like there's something happening now. And so that wasn't like, and so we had the songs, like we had the International, we had Bella Ciao and all of that kind of stuff. So I'm hearing these things, and it was very beautiful in the sense that, you'd have a meeting that these farm workers would call, and then everybody's singing Bella Ciao together, and everyone is like excited. And so I got this idea of music coming together. And also I got the idea of, we would try to do these theatrical things. Like they'd be like, okay, Raymond, which is my name, you gotta get the caravan together, and it needs to start at the fields when we get off work at noon. And, because they're going off to work, right? So, and there should be a speech, there should be a song, and there should be a skit. Like, it would really be like that. And like, you don't have to do it, but like, you gotta make sure that this happens, because when work gets off, we want to walk out, we want to be talking to the workers, and we want to have a point where everybody can gather. And so that's like kind of how I learned about art, right? Is that like doing really corny, really bad little sketches, right? And then through that, I also would try to get folk, when I came back to Oakland, I tried to get folks involved, and I had friends that were rappers when I wasn't. And my way of tricking them into coming to an anti-police brutality rally would be like, you're gonna get to rap. There's gonna be an audience. There's gonna be 100 people there, knowing there was only gonna be 8 or 10 people there. But like, you'll be able to rap. And then I had a friend named Johnny who would be like, well, I'm only gonna come and rap if you'll be my hype man. And so then that's really how I started performing, was so that my boy Johnny would come to these things, right? Yeah.
This work that you did then, does it influence the work you do now? Do the things you grow out of, does what you do now grow out of that?
Oh, immensely. So some of my ideas about what organizers should be, which I hadn't read about yet. You can read these things in books and stuff, but I was seeing it with them and hadn't read about it. Like, they knew everybody. Like, there's a dude named Jose Luis. I'm forgetting his last name. And even if people hate him, because mind you, the way that they got a lot of people to be against these folks was like, oh, you're Catholic, they're communists, fuck them, or whatever. So there would be people in the neighborhood that definitely disagreed with these folks, but they knew them, right? They knew them, and not just because they're in a small town, but they knew them and talked to them, had dinner with them, you know, played games with them. It gave me, you know, the idea of how people are supposed to be, how you're supposed to try to, you know, they weren't just trying to win arguments. They were trying to get people to be involved with them, right? And that definitely changed, you know, gave me, and you can read about stuff like that in like Rules for Radicals, Saul Alinsky or whatever, but it's much different. Had I not seen that, I might not have thought it that applicable. And so definitely it changed the way that I do art. Like, so I knew that everybody, for instance, in that town, everybody was mad at the ranch owners. Everybody knew that, you know, all these kids were getting cancer from the pesticides. They knew all this stuff. The only question was whether they could win, right? So the anger, I knew, didn't cause them to get involved. They were all angry. They all could see that things were, and some of them had even more developed analysis of what was going wrong. When they got involved was when they saw the apparatus by which they could win. And so all of my songs, you know, I try to, it's never me being like, shit is terrible, right? Like, to me, that doesn't do it. That just adds to, like, people like, yeah, you're right. That's why I'm, you know, that's why I'm just trying to get by, right? And so it's always been, shit is terrible, and here is how we can win, right? And that's what, and so I have a disagreement with a lot of my friends who are artists who have radical inclinations. And you know, this is very big in the punk world, which is like, it's all about anger and it's all blah, blah, blah. And I think that aesthetic from punk, which was kind of this rebellion, you know, at some certain points, rebellion without any clear direction of which they're rebelling, kind of added to this sort of like little club thing that happened that had an unfortunately big influence on modern radical movements and how people organize, how people critique each other, things like that. So yeah.
Where are we going to go with all this anger now? I mean, you talk about anger, there's a lot going on, and the call to action, what you're talking about is like, something, what are we doing? You know, and we started this conversation with, there's all these strikes that maybe a lot of people don't even know about. So we don't know where we're going in the next few, whatever, weeks. We don't know what's going to happen. But from your point of view, whatever happens, whatever the outcome might be politically, we don't know. But what are we supposed to do? What are we supposed to do with our feelings as an artist, you know, and as a
I'm assuming most of the people listening aren't artists, right? Right. So I would want to start with, or if they are artists, they have other jobs, right? Because many people are artists. But I would say people have to organize at their workplace, because the kind and what I mean by that and it can start at various places, but we need a radical mass militant movement that can withhold labor as a tactic, as a strategy to winning gains in social justice, right? So we need to start, though, by organizing around where people will organize, which is whatever changes need to happen at the job. That's where we need to be organized. We don't need to just be finding each other on the internet and getting to the people that we agree with, because even before the internet, people were doing that. Let's meet on Saturday and have the rally at Saturday at noon downtown, and whatever. We need to be organizing on the job and building power bases that can shut down industries. And a lot of these inroads are happening, but they're not getting publicized. Speaking of the longshoremen, during Black Lives Matter, they did a symbolic shutdown of the whole West Coast, right? And longshoremen in the Bay Area are 80% Black folks, and that has to do with the whole history that happened here. But they shut down the whole West Coast as a symbolic thing. Tesla workers actually joined in, but Elon Musk kind of nipped that in the bud and immediately declared it a holiday so it wouldn't seem like a strike and spread more. But the point is that folks are looking for ways to actually have power in these situations, and we have to show it to them. We need to be putting these movements that are a meeting of radical politic or progressive and politic and labor, right, out there. We need to help them grow. And the way we can help them grow first is by letting folks know that they're happening. Because, so for instance, when the Amazon warehouse had a work stoppage in New York, that news being spread out immediately, like when I retweeted about it, folks got to me later, and that news caused at least 12 work stoppages at different different grocery stores, like within the next couple days after that. Like just hearing that is happening made other people do it. The point is that how have there been 900 strikes since March 16th in the United States alone? And probably most of the listeners don't know about it.
Yeah,
that's a concerted effort to not talk about it. And I think that there are also folks that don't necessarily make the connection how that is something that they should be talking about as part of a more radical movement and this radical change around Black Lives Matter, things like that. But the whole point is, the reason why people don't get involved is they think that they don't have the leverage, even if they got involved with something. Right. And that is something that people see happening. We Occupy Oakland. I've been organizing in Oakland since so many years ago. And when Occupy Oakland called for a general strike, and it wasn't technically a general strike, but it was 50,000 people, right? They called for a general strike. That was the most like average everyday Black folks that I hadn't seen involved in anything else come and be involved in anything up until that point, right? And my sense from talking to as many folks as I could talk to and, the year since, was that because they could see how that strategy could work on a larger level. They got excited, with the many people with the, yeah, now that's what I'm talking about, right? But we've had so many decades of nonprofit organizations that have had these parameters on what they will talk about and what they will prescribe as the answer, that a lot of folks that did have radical politics, but had been involved in these nonprofit organizations, good folks kind of didn't know how to deal with something like that.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's part of it. We have to be organizing, you know, where we are on the job, in the neighborhoods. As artists, we got to talk about these things. If you're being an artist, I mean, struggle goes on in all of our lives, all the time, no matter what. And I don't mean just individual struggle. I'm talking about collective, organized struggle. It's happening somewhere, even if it's in the background of your life, even if it's there. How do we have all of this art? Let's just take movies. How do we have all of these movies that take place on the job, and there's none of that anywhere around in that world, right? It's an editing that we do because we've been told what's important. We've been told what to look at, what we should talk about, and this and that, right? So, you know, and to where when we talk about it, it seems weird and out of place when we talk about it in our work. But meanwhile, we'll talk about all these different cliches that aren't necessarily already connected to what's happening in our life, right? They're like, you know, I always say this, like, we've seen the noontime cafe date in 1 million movies. Very rarely, I've never seen people on a cafe date at noon, right? People are working, they're gonna, you know, like, but somebody did it in a couple movies, and now that's what happens, right? Now that's what happens. And, you know, it's probably something that happens more in certain fields. So, you know, you're in Hollywood, everybody's meeting up and doing that sort of thing. But the point is that as viewers, we become used to that. Oh, this is the noontime cafe date scene where we learn something about this character that otherwise we wouldn't have known. You know, we're used to that. But if you throw in organized struggle in there, then it's like, oh, that's weird.
You know,
right?
so
because we're just not used to it.
So, Boots, you know, how do we deal with protests today when we have, at this moment in time, snarling racism, you know, guns, people being shot, people being knocked to the ground, being shot with, you know, pellets, being, you know, tear gassed. You know, it seems like we're entering an element of you know, radical, you know, reversal to a primitive time. You know, how do you mitigate those circumstances?
You know, I think we should all just wait till everything cools down. Wait till they stop doing that. We'll like just wait. Yeah, just wait till a more peaceful time when they're not going to do that, and then we choose our time right, and then we try to make a movement again, and then if they do start shooting tear gas, then we stop and wait for another time after that. No, I don't think any of that. I'm lying. We have to organize in any situations that are happening. Like, you know, because the truth is that, you know, it's kind of like if you're going to go play a baseball game and people ask, why did you lose? And you're like, well, the other team got all those hits.
Right.
Like, what were we supposed to do? They got all those hits. You're supposed to stop them. And that's part of the game. That's part of the struggle. We know that that's going to happen. So,
with nonviolence, stop them with nonviolence?
With whatever it takes, I mean, a strike, for instance, is not nonviolent, right? Like, if you're stopping somebody from going in to some place,
yeah,
we can call it whatever we want, but it's not nonviolent at all, right? And it's everything we do is based. We have to be tactical about it, right? We have to be, you know. But the whole debate of nonviolence versus violence is usually just, it ends up being something that's just distracting to on whatever side. It's not really even a debate. So my father was first involved in the civil rights movement. Then he was involved in more radical things later on in the 60s. And he always talks about how when they had the civil rights movement, there were a lot of people that would be like, I'm not I'm not coming to that, because you're talking about if they slap us, I'm supposed to let them not do anything, right? And they were like, well, this is just a tactic because blah, 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 this and that. Then later he got involved in more radical groups that espouse violent revolution. And then people were like, y'all are crazy, right? Like, I'm not getting involved with that, blah, 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 this and that. We keep talking about these tactics, and it's really not a hard and set philosophy. It's really, there's always gonna be a debate that is couched in the idea of not doing whatever everybody is doing, right? And so there are real theoretical debates to be had about that, but they should also always be had by doing.
Boots, we are so over, like we're gonna, this is the end of this session, but boy, we would love to talk to you and see what happens in a couple of weeks or months or something, if you might come back.
All right, okay, cool.
Yeah, Boots, this was great. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I'm very long-winded.
Yeah, well, it's perfect for this.
Not, I didn't even get to talk about Teatro Campesino, which I know we can do that another time, because it's about, I just love that it's all your purpose, you have to do it. And there's a lot for us all to do.
And I guess I was in the middle of, this whole thing has been me in the middle of answering that question. Teatro Campesino, the theater to film school is what I did. And I got a record deal while we were in film school.
Everybody watch his film, please, everybody go and look at his work. And sorry to bother you. And we're all gonna do I'm a Virgo, and whenever that's coming out. And stay safe, but stay strong and keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you. You all too. Thanks so much for what you're doing and all the work and all the spheres.
Wow, he was great. That was great conversation.
Yeah, there's so much with him. It's pretty amazing. What a remarkable person and a great thinker. And let's go see, I can't wait to see the series I'm a Virgo.
Yeah, sounds like it's going to be incredible.
Pretty
okay, I'll see you in the next one.
See you later.